Should you watch your pace or your heart rate when you're doing a zone 2 training session? And is 2 hours continuous better than 2 times 1 hour of training? Those are two questions that I received recently from some of you guys, and I wanted to take a few minutes to answer. So I'm going to start with the first question. Is it better to look at your pace? In this context, if we're running, we could do the parallel with your power, so your watts. If you're on a bike, is it better to look at your pace or watts, or your heart rate for a low intensity training session? And my answer would be that both of those metrics are important. And I would even go a little step farther and add a third metric to kind of complete this triad, what we call the 3 Ps, that was popularized by Dr. Steven Seiler. And those are performance, physiology, and perception. So we already have a performance metric with either the pace in running or the power output on a bike. The physiology will be covered by the heart rate in this question, but we could have a lactate measurement, a muscle oximetry measurement, or else. And finally, we have the perception metric. So this is what I would add into this answer. I wouldn't just go with the two. I would actually take your perception, your rating of perceived exertion in account to quantify or to qualify the quality of your low intensity or your zone 2 training session. And how to do that concretely? Well, if you can have one of each, if you can have one metric of performance, one physiology metric, and one perceptive metric, you're just going to increase the likelihood that your session is actually targeting the right thing and that you're getting the outcome that you're seeking. So for a zone 2 session, what would I aim for? Let's take an hour-long training session. And let's assume for those of you that run, that you can already run an hour comfortably, so we don't get into any risks of injuries or anything like that. If we're doing an hour-long zone 2 session, what I would look for first and foremost is the RPE. I want your rating of perceived exertion, your perception of difficulty, rated between 1 and 10, very, very simply. 10 being the hardest effort you could do in this modality. So if you're running, it'll be running. If you're cycling, it's cycling. The hardest effort you can do on the time that we're talking about. So here we're talking about 1 hour. And what I would look for a zone 2 session is somewhere between 2 and 3. I know some people talk about doing closer to 4 and 5, and we can go into those considerations sometimes, in my opinion. But for me, a zone 2 session should be easy. And most people tend to do them too hard. So I tend to pull down just a little bit to compensate the other way. So usually I'll give you 2 to 3 out of 10 in terms of difficulty for a low intensity training session. Now, obviously, we said it before, we don't just want to look at RPE, so we're going to add the heart rate in there. Now, what kind of heart rate should we look at for a zone 2 training session? And I'm not going to give you a percentage of heart rate max. I'm not going to give you a percentage of heart rate reserve, simply because those values do not apply to the individual. The 70% heart rate max that we typically see as a guideline for zone 2, 70% is the average of population. And if we take the example of the hundreds of tests that I've done on different types of athletes, well, guess what? The average of the 150, I think, tests that I've aggregated to find out this data, the percent of heart rate max at the upper boundary of zone 2 for the average is 70%. So this 70% is correct on a population level, but we have to remember that averages are nobody. You are not the average. You are one individual on this distribution, and you might be higher than, you might be lower than, you might be right onto that average, but you are not the average. So simply taking 70% for everybody as a blanket, in my opinion, will yield some issues when it comes to intensity control. For some people, it'll be too high. For some people, it'll be too low. For some people, it might be just right, but it might be just right today, but it won't be that just right a year from now. When you train, your physiology changes, and now we have different parameters to play with. So instead of a percentage, what I would recommend is looking at your heart rate drift. And what that means is looking at how your heart rate behaves during that 1 hour long session. So look at your heart rate at minute 10 after you've warmed up a little bit and gotten to your pace. Again, respecting that 2 to 3 out of 10. And then look at your heart rate at the 60th minute, at the end of your hour-long session, and look at the difference between the two. Ideally, for a low-intensity session, we would like this heart rate to stay the same. So we want an absence of heart rate drift, cardiac drift, and this is going to tell us that we've been able to maintain a steady state at the muscular level. Again, that's a kind of a simplification of what is happening, but the effort remains very, very easy for your body to tolerate, and that is usually shown by the absence of cardiac drift. Now, I usually allow up to 5 beats per minute increase between minute 10 and minute 60. You'll typically find that for more powerful, more muscular, more type 2 fiber athletes, that drift will happen much, much sooner. For endurance type 1 fibered athletes, we'll see this plateau go much, much longer, typically, again, on average. But what I would like to see for a low intensity session is for this heart rate to stay nice and stable. So that's, you got your 2 to 3 out of 10. And then you got your absence of cardiac drift or very minimal cardiac drift. And those will be, for me, the two most important aspects of your low intensity session. Then obviously to this, you'll associate a wattage on a bike or a pace if you're running, but the pace is the result of the other two, okay? So I'd rather you pay close attention to your internal metrics, to your internal load. Both the RPE and the heart rate are both measures of internal load of what your body has to do inside. And then the pace or the wattage is the external load. It's the work that your body is producing. So again, we want to look at all three of those. We don't want to just look at one or just look at the other. I think if we can triangulate and look at those three, we're going to have a better answer. And if you have a good understanding of those three parameters, you'll also be able to see and quantify progress much more easily over time, because if you maintain the same pace, but your heart rate goes down and your RPE goes down, this is progress. Or the other way around, for a given heart rate, if your pace increases after 3 months, after 6 months, well, you know you've progressed. And again, we want to look at chronic change, not just session by session, especially with heart rate, because that can be influenced by fatigue, that can be influenced by the environment, by heat. So we have to take all these things into consideration. But big picture, if you have a good understanding of your pace, your heart rate, and your RPE for a given format, for a given session, this is a very, very viable way, very easy way to look at progress over time. Now let's talk about the second question that I was going to approach in this video. If we take 2 hours of zone 2 training, is it better to do 2 hours continuous, or should we split it up into 2 times 1 hour? Now, to answer this question, we need to bring in some context. And what is context when we answer those questions about training, about physiology? We're going to have to take into account the type of athlete. So are you an endurance profile? Are you a powerful profile? So a slow twitch dominant athlete, a fast twitch dominant athlete. That is one parameter that we take in the context. Another one would be, what is your history in sports? So what sports have you practiced in the past? What are you good at? What are you made for? What are you better suited for in terms of types of effort, duration of effort, intensity of effort? That's another parameter. We can also look at what sport you currently practice and what type of competition you're getting ready for. What moment of the season you find yourself in. Are you in the general phase, away from competition? Are you in a more specific phase, closer to competition? And if we can answer all those different parameters and understand the context, we'll be able then to better answer this question. And also the level of your fluency in low intensity training. How much low intensity have you done? That'll also impact whether 2 times 1 or 1 times 2 hours of zone 2 is better for you. And to start answering this more concretely, we could say that for somebody who's a beginner that hasn't really done any amount of endurance training, I would recommend starting with 2 times 1 hour, simply because that's going to generate less fatigue than 2 hours continuous. Especially on the run, we want to be careful with the run and always progress that intelligently. I made another video about this on the channel. Feel free to go and check this out if you're interested in understanding how you can progress your running over time. But really, for somebody who's got less experience, we're going to split it up. Somebody who's got more experience, we could do the 2 hours straight. It's going to go just fine, but it's also going to have a different load compared, and a different fatigue profile compared to the 2 times 1 hour. Obviously, if you're used to doing 5-hour, 6-hour efforts, maybe once or twice a week because you run ultras, well, 2 hours is going to be a piece of cake. But if you're a CrossFitter who's never done anything longer than 30 minutes, and it's a caricature, but you'll understand my point, then obviously 2 hours is a very, very long time. Nothing to do with the intensity, but just to understand the idea. So I wouldn't necessarily say that one is better than the other. Now, if you're trying to develop, say, durability, so the resistance to fatigue and be able to perform closer to your potential after an amount of work accumulated, after fatigue has accumulated, then obviously the 2 hours continuous will be more interesting than the 2 times 1 hours. But you must have earned the right to do that session, right? So start with the 2 times 1, go towards the 2 hours continuous. Now, if we take the idea of specificity, when it comes to the sport you practice at the competition that you're going to do, well, if you're training for a marathon, well, the 2 hours continuous is going to be more specific than the 2 times 1 hour. So you might want to progress towards that closer to your competition. But inversely, for a CrossFitter, the 2 hour continuous will probably appear farther away from competition in the general phase, early preseason even, when we're building some volume and building some capacity. That is then going to transfer into the specifics of the sport as we get closer and closer to the competitions. So we have to take context into account when we want to answer those questions about which session is better, which training is better. And honestly, at the end of the day, I would tell you that they're pretty close, one and the other. Yes, there's those considerations of durability. Yes, there's those considerations of specificity. But the most important part is actually doing the work, doing it consistently, and then maintaining that discipline over time. And this is what, in the end, is going to bring you the best results. It's not to have the perfect pace, the perfect heart rate, the perfect RPE, the perfect duration, but it's going to be to do the work consistently over time. And this is what brings results. If you're interested in learning more about that, Steven Seiler published a really interesting paper recently on high intensity training, showing that there's no best format, there's no best interval type. There's really just the accumulation of quality session over time that will bring you results regardless of what you're trying to do. So just stay consistent, listen to yourself, adjust load over time if needed, and enjoy your training. I'll see you in the next video.